If you're the listing agent and an unrepresented buyer comes through your open house, calls you off your sign, or meets you because of the seller's property, I don't think your first move should be to make the buyer your client. And I want to be clear about something right from the beginning. I'm not saying dual agency is bad. There are situations where dual agency is completely appropriate. Let's say you've been working with a buyer for 6 months. You've established a relationship with them, you represent them, you know what they're looking for. Then you list a house that happens to be a great fit for that buyer. They want to buy it. Now you have an existing relationship with the seller and an existing relationship with the buyer. That's where dual agency makes sense, assuming everyone understands it, agrees to it, and the proper disclosures and consent are handled. I have no problem with that. What I'm talking about is something different. You list the seller's home, an unrepresented buyer walks into the open house. They love it. They say, I don't have an agent. Can you write the offer? And the listing agent immediately turns that buyer into a client and creates dual agency. Why? You don't need to do that. You can work with that buyer as a customer. And in most situations, the compensation to the listing side isn't changing simply because the buyer becomes your client instead of remaining your customer. So this isn't really a commission conversation. It's a representation conversation. Think about the seller for a minute. The seller hired you. They interviewed you. They chose you to represent their interest. They probably told you things about their motivation, timing, concerns, negotiating position, and what they're hoping to accomplish. Then somebody walks into their house because of their listing. And now you're giving that person the same level of representation. I don't think that's necessary. And I don't think it's fair to the seller when there is another perfectly reasonable way to handle it. Be clear with the buyer. I represent the seller. You can still treat that buyer extremely well. You can provide the appropriate disclosures. You can provide factual information about the property. You can explain the process. You can handle the paperwork with them as a customer within the limits of that relationship. What you aren't doing is becoming their advocate against your seller. That's the important distinction, because a customer and a client are not the same thing. If I'm representing a buyer, I want to advise them. I want to talk strategy with them. I want to help them determine what they should offer. I want to help them think through terms. I want to advise them through inspections and negotiations. I want to advocate for their interests. That's what representation is. But if I'm already representing the seller, how am I going to turn around and provide the same advocacy to a buyer I met 5 minutes ago in the seller's kitchen? I don't need to. They can remain a customer. Now compare that to a buyer I've already been representing. That's different. If one of my buyer clients wants to purchase one of my listings, I'm not going to tell them, well, now that you like my listing, I don't represent you anymore. We already have that relationship. I'm not going to abandon one client simply because their interests have crossed with another client's interests. That's a legitimate dual agency situation. We disclose it, we explain what changes. Both parties need to understand the limitations that come with dual agency. They decide whether they're comfortable moving forward with it. And if they are, that's okay. The distinction I want everyone to understand is how we got there. Did two legitimate client relationships happen to come together on the same property? Or did we unnecessarily create a second client relationship after an unrepresented buyer walked into our seller's house? Those are very different situations. And there's another reason that this is important. Clear agency relationships are easier for everyone to understand. The seller knows you're representing the seller. The buyer knows you're representing the buyer. Nobody's confused about whose interests you're advocating for. The buyer can decide whether they're comfortable proceeding as a customer or whether they want their own representation. That's their choice. But we shouldn't automatically create dual agency for them. So when an unrepresented buyer comes through one of your listings and wants to write an offer, don't overcomplicate it. Explain your relationship with the seller. Explain what it means for the buyer to remain a customer. Handle the appropriate paperwork. Stay within the boundaries of that relationship. And if the buyer wants their own representation, they should have it. On the other hand, if a buyer you already represent or a buyer you otherwise have an established relationship with wants to purchase your listing, dual agency may be the appropriate way to handle that situation. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Just make sure everybody understands exactly what it means before moving forward. The goal isn't to avoid dual agency at all costs. The goal is not to create a dual agency when it doesn't need to exist. Protect the relationship you already have with your sellers, be clear with the buyer, and make sure everybody understands exactly who you represent. That's all for this week. See you around.